I'm Wes Clary, a PhD student at the University of New Mexico. I'd like to thank my advisor, Lindsay Worthington, and my co-authors, Lou Scuderi, John Swartz, Sean Gulick, and Elias Gutierrez. What I'm going to talk about today is climate, tectonic, and surface process interactions in the Gulf of Alaska. Specifically, our study is to relate how drainage shapes relate to major features that we see. We're trying to use principal component analysis and geographically weighted regression to predict the shape index, which is related to the drainage shape. And then we're going to check our results with geophysical observations. So there's a number of climate and tectonic and surface process feedbacks that exist. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples here. The first example is an interaction with tectonics. So with enough uplift, we can reach a point where we achieve cloud capture. And once we achieve cloud capture, that gives us sort of an enhanced climate. And what we see then is enhanced precipitation. This might lead us to affect the fluvial incision processes as well. Another example is that tectonics, the grinding around of the faults, reduces the grain size. And this can cause enhanced erodibility. The enhanced erodibility obviously would have an impact on fluvial incision. If it's easier to erode those sediments, they might erode a bigger channel or a differently shaped channel. And I'm not going to go over every possible example of this feedback loop, but the point here is that these processes and features affect the sediment distribution. And the sediment and dense flows are routed by the drainage network. Our hypothesis is that the drainage cross-section shape is determined by competing processes which occur nearby the associated features for tectonics and surface processes such as ice sheet extents or faults. What we can deliver with respect to this by using principal component analysis and geographic weighted regression is how and where these features relate to drainage cross-section shape. Let's take a look at the major elements in the Gulf of Alaska region. What's going on here is the Pacific Plate is being subducted under North America, and we have an overriding plate here. We have a microplate sort of wedged between these, and as all these plates are sort of being subducted and grinding around against each other, we're forming a thrust wedge, which is sediments that are scraped off. And on top of all that, what we have are glaciers that are remnants of larger ice sheet extents in the past. These elements have resulted in the current seafloor conditions that we see now. So this is sort of a close-up view of those elements all together. So this is the relevant data except for our drainage network. And we can see the last glacial maximum shown here in kind of a blue-gray and the maximum glacial extent. This is data from Manley et al. Out of UC Boulder. And we start generating our stream network. We used 800 contributing cells, and we used several filters in order to make this a more realistic drainage network. The idea here was that we wanted to extract profiles within our drainage network. So we created 500 locations, and we took profiles at each location. I executed this in Model Builder, and I had a talk last year about how I did that. You can see an example here of one of these profiles. And this is how we analyzed it. We wanted to extract the shape index. So what you see here is the profile plotted, and what this is basically the exponent of this function. So if it's a 0.5, we have a shape that's sort of square root. It would look sort of very much like a curved V, and as the shape index gets higher and higher, approaching 4, we have sort of a boxy shape. We measured these shape indices all throughout our study area, but we also extracted several other parameters related at these locations. So we did the coordinates, the distance from these glacial extents, we used Sobel edge detection, we used aspect, slope, relief, all these different things. Here come the graphs. We did a correlation matrix, and this was sort of the basis of how we started thinking about this data in terms of just the raw data. We had our conceptual diagram of all these feedback loops, but we combined that with this correlation matrix to make some interpretations. And keep in mind, what we want to do here is to predict the shape index of these channels. We took all these measurements and parameters, and we ran this through ordinary least squares to determine what would be the best number of parameters to include. And I'm only showing you the relative r-squareds here, but we determined that we had a little peak here at 4. So we selected 4 to be our best number of variables. We wanted to reduce the data because we had extracted some 17 parameters. So we did a principal component analysis. We noticed that the x and y, which are spatial components, dominated the signal. And that was kind of a problem. So we wanted to use a spatial method, and we wanted to remove those spatial variables from our data because they dominated so much of the variance. And so what we came up with was let's go ahead and take that x, y out of our parameters, and let's let the method be spatial. So we picked geographically weighted regression, which fits each feature with a local model. The parameters we selected were instability, the 2 ice sheet extents, and the fault distance. So we selected these based on the length of these vectors that you can see here. So, like I suggested, the GWR technique is where we fit each feature with a local multivariable regression. It's a quantitative method to rank the importance of these parameters. I went over this example yesterday, and Esri provides an illustration of crime as a function of population and income. And as the crime function varies spatially, the coefficients beta 1 and beta 2 are allowed to change. By comparing the relative coefficients, we can determine the local relationship throughout the study area. There's some benefits and challenges here. The main benefit is that it allows our parameters to be ranked locally. This also allows us to visualize on a map where we had which parameters that were dominant. So we are going to be able to see on a map where was the fault the dominant process. Where does the ice sheet explain more of the shape index variation? And multicollinearity is one of the challenges that we face when we do sort of any multivariable regression. I talked about this actually quite a bit in the lightning talk, and I resolved it a little bit more with Monte Carlo method. You'll have to see that one there. This is just a one-run GWR this time. Keep in mind that this is still just a regression. It's going to require validation and explanation, like many of our other presenters today have discussed. So, in summary, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do geographically weighted regression on the channel shape index using these 4 parameters: faults, instability, and 2 ice sheet extents. So we transformed these all into distance rasters because we had assumed that the processes were operating nearby these features. This is essentially what it looks like. So we ran the GWR and we plotted our results as pie charts here. And I have masked any areas where we had a local r-squared of less than 0.26, which was sort of an arbitrary cutoff, but if you back that out to what the r value would be, I picked it based on that. You can see here that maybe in the areas where we didn't have a great fit, other parameters might explain it better. So it might have been that in this area we didn't have a good fit, that depth was a better parameter, or something we didn't quite think of yet. I've plotted here also the distribution of significance. So I put a dark circle around the points where we had significant coefficients. That's something you need to be aware of when you do geographically weighted regression. And what I see here with this is that we have a pretty good spread. Not every single point was significant, but most of the map is covered by coefficients which were significant. We notice here some clustering. This is what you want to look for. We see a cluster here with this instability zone, and we also see sort of a zone where there's maybe a dominant fault coefficient. But this is pretty hard to interpret, right? So we can simplify a little bit, and what I've done here is just remove the pie chart, and I've plotted only the color of the maximum coefficient. So we can see here that there's similar clusters. We still have sort of a zone towards the middle and west where we have a cluster of red here, and that means that the fault is the dominant process. And we have the same little cluster of instability. we noticed that we have these white points near where the LGM had prominent lobes. We can see that the MGL had dominance sort of more well distributed across the shelf in comparison. But we had this area in the southwest that was pretty hard to explain, so I've sort of highlighted that in rainbow here because we have a good mix, and I have a hard time sort of relating specifically the ice sheets or the faults or anything to something so far out and so deep. So until I can come up with a process to specifically say why it should be associated with one or another, I haven't really felt like I've validated this area yet. But we're going to go ahead and evaluate this with geophysical observations. We have a few different data types here. We have sub-bottom profiles. I've shown one in red. We have a few different seismic vintages. And we have a background of backscattered sonar. So just really briefly here, where we have high values in the sonar, which are light-colored, we're basically thinking of that as bedrock or fault scarps or dense sediments. Whereas when we have sort of the darker colors, these are a low response, as I've plotted it, and we think of this as mud or sort of lighter sediments or just shadows. This is also affected by topography. We might not have had any response, and that might be why it's low there. So this is a little bit of density and a little bit of topography when you look at sort of a backscatter map like this. In general, if you look at areas 3 and 4 here, I think these are probably associated with failure zones. They're a little bit more small variations as opposed to areas 1 and 2, which are sort of larger wavelength variations. And I think these are more likely to be associated with something like a moraine or any feature more directly associated with an ice sheet. So let's look at our first site, and what we're going to see here is a few different things. We see some shallow shelf edge faults in the backscattered sonar, and we also see these in the seismic line GOA 2505. We see on our GWR map that we have some fault signal there. We have a little point with a red wedge on it, and so we're seeing the fault as a process here. When we look at the instability, what we see is on the seismic line, I can see sort of a Nike swoosh symbol that is sort of slid towards me, right? And when you look on the Gloria data, what you see is sort of a variegated, kind of arcuate, almost thumbprint pattern in the circle. And these sorts of features are what we expect to see on a slump or a slide. And then when we think about what we see with the LGM ice sheet lobe, well, we see this little area on the GWR map where we have some sort of dominant gray wedge there on our pie chart, and that corresponds to where we have the LGM extent. When we look at the sub-bottom profile data, we can see several things. We see an erosional surface here on the north-northwest end. We see a very flat plain that may have been resurfaced in the past by the last glacial max. And what we're thinking here is that this whole little bank, if you will, might have been a preserved feature from a previous glacial extent. If we look at Site 2, what we're going to see here is a change in orientation of the drainage network across the fault. And you can see that we're going sort of north-south, right, north of the fault. And once we go to the south of the fault, it goes sort of more almost east-west. And what we see here on the seismic data, in A, we see sort of a lot of little debris that has slid together, and that seems to be creating sort of a square root shape in our shape index. But on the upper slope, we seem to see more U-shapes. I've blown this up in the seismic data. We can also look at this in our shape index map and our GWR results, and what we see is sort of north of the faults, we have sort of a different combination. So we have sort of red and blue and gray, and these are a different combination of parameters than we see south of the fault, which seems to be dominated by the blue and gray, the ice sheet processes. If we look at our third site, what we see here is on the shorter lines in the GWR map, we see deep faults. We see relatively continuous upper sediments, and we see what looks to me like shallow slumping in the bottom seismic line here. On our GWR map, we see a strong instability signal and a strong fault signal. These groupings seem to make sense. When we look at the larger scale line, crossing through highlighted here in pink, what we see is, again, shallow slumping, but nothing that's really connected too deep. And it seems like this slumping and instability here is driven by uplift on the major faults and folds. In this case, the slumping actually occurs towards the shelf, which is a little bit unusual. And I think because the slumping occurs towards the shelf and we see these big faults here, that this has to be a case of instability being almost directly driven by the uplift on the faults and folds. So basically, a lot of our GWR results made sense based on what we see in the additional geophysical data. And next we're going to look at what those coefficients look like sort of globally here. So we can ask questions of these coefficients like, does blank process result in more U or V-shaped trends? We saw with the MGL and LGM that these were negative values. It was more associated with U-shapes nearby. And we can also rank the absolute effect size by looking at the absolute value of those coefficients and ask questions like, which factor best explains the drainage cross-section shape? We found that the ice sheets on average had much bigger coefficients than either the faults, and you can see the ranking here. So finally, our results combined with interpretation of geophysical data provide insight into the combination of geologic processes happening here and controlling the shape index. We saw that the ice sheets explained the most drainage shape variation, and that the trend was U-shaped nearby those. We could see that by the value of the coefficient. The distance from an instability zone had the strongest local correlation, that had the biggest coefficient overall locally. And we saw that we had fault coefficients which dominated nearby a certain fault here, the transition fault, which has created a lot of variable seafloor topography and slope failure. Thank you.